Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to talk with you all about faster-than-light travel. Specifically, the Lightspeed hyperdrives of Star Wars as compared to the warp drives of Star Trek. Also, there's a coffee link in the description if you want to support the channel. Before we get started, let me start with the elephant in the room. In Star Wars, lightspeed is a colloquial term. It doesn't literally mean the speed of light. You can tell this right away by the fact that anyone going anywhere in the Star Wars galaxy doesn't take thousands of years to do so, and the fact that relativity isn't kicking in and aging the rest of the galaxy thousands of years for every year spent traveling. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and pivot now to Star Trek and its warp drive because it's actually based in something resembling reality and even has real numbers attached to it, so even if the stories themselves don't necessarily follow the rules all the time, they're relatively consistent. I'll come back to Star Wars in a bit. Also, I want to mention now that the warp scale was not established until after the original series, so the stuff that they're able to do in that series, totally nuts by later Trek standards, but, they decided to dial things in a bit later on. Alright, so the fundamental thing in all forms of faster-than-light travel is that you cannot travel faster than light, so you have to cheat in some way. In the case of warp drive, which is actually a real concept, though the power requirements are just insane, you travel faster than light despite not actually moving all that fast physically because you're literally warping space-time around yourself. So you're contracting the space in front of your ship while stretching the space behind you. Effectively, you're not traveling all that fast. You're just shortening the distance between the 2 points while traveling. Basically, you're making your own shortcut. In Star Trek, warp drive allows ships to travel much faster than light, though on a cosmic scale the warp factors can still feel pretty glacial since space, after all, is really big. It's a logarithmic scale, with warp 1 just being light speed, and warp 10 being infinite velocity, which amounts to being in all places at the same time. You'll see warp factors above 10 sometimes, but that's more just a readjustment to the warp factor scale than a speed faster than infinite, since referring to going to warp factor 9.9999995 gets pretty cumbersome. Across the series, warp 10 has only been done twice, and it resulted in some half Janeway, half Tom Paris lizard babies being abandoned on a distant planet, so I wouldn't dwell on that too much. Alright. So on screen, you can see here there's a chart explaining the speeds of the different warp factors. You'll notice, though, that even the iconic Warp 9 that we hear ordered by Picard all the time is a whopping 1,516 times the speed of light. That sounds pretty fast, right? Well, unfortunately, at that speed, it would take about 70 years to traverse the Milky Way galaxy, and that's assuming that you stay at Warp 9 the whole time and never need to refuel or resupply or anything, and that you can take a straight line path. So yeah, Warp 9 is fast, but not that fast. Let's pivot over to Star Wars. Unfortunately, we don't have a handy-dandy chart full of hyperdrive ratings and their equivalent light speeds, but what we do have is some demonstrations of people going from place to place with their vaguely defined relative locations and equally badly defined transit times. So here we go with some wild approximation. In Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the main characters go from Naboo to Tatooine, hang out for a few days, then from Tatooine to Coruscant, hang out a few more days, and then hop back from Coruscant back to Naboo. And this whole trip just takes a matter of days. For the sake of argument, let's call it a month of total actual travel time, since that gives the Trade Federation plenty of time to do their invasion and all that. Now we get into the issue that we don't actually know how far apart these planets are, beyond just what we see in maps. But what we do have is that the Star Wars galaxy is supposed to be about 120,000 light years across. So we can do some back-of-the-napkin math based on the apparent gaps between the planets in question. For this particular trip, for back and forth, Amidala and crew traveled to what amounts to approximately 90% of the way across the galaxy, since they go back and forth from the mid-rim to the outer rim to the core to the mid-rim again. Using our 1 month of travel time, which isn't canon, I'm just throwing out a number, that would mean that the Naboo Royal Cruiser was traveling at about 1.3 million times the speed of light. And that's assuming a straight-line direct route. Let's look at another example. In A New Hope, or just Star Wars for you old-school fans out there, Han, Luke, and company travel from Tatooine to Alderaan, or at least what's left of Alderaan, in some other short span of time. Let's call it a week, since we know that the Millennium Falcon is pretty quick. That trip had them cross about 40% of the galaxy, and based on my wild approximations, so 48,000 light years or so in a week, which would put the Falcon doing about 2.5 million times the speed of light. again, assuming a direct straight line route. Now, it makes sense for the Falcon to be faster than the Naboo ship since it carries a Class 0.5 hyperdrive and the Naboo ship only carries a Class 1.8. For context, the way that this works is hyperdrives come in a bunch of classes up to Class 10. None are quantified in terms of how fast they actually are, and instead are more of a ratio of speed. Class 10 is the baseline, and everything is measured as a ratio from there. So a Class 0.5 is twice as fast as a 1, and 3.6 times faster than the Royal Naboo ship with its 1.8. So I'll have to do some numbers fiddling to get those ratios to line up with my back-of-the-napkin math, but it doesn't honestly matter all that much. It would be beside the point. Now, we've already talked about Star Trek warp drives and how fast they are, and they seem pretty quick based on the numbers we're seeing and what they can do on screen, but despite how quick they are in cosmic terms, they're still glacially slow. This is even a plot point. The whole Voyager show is predicated on warp speeds being so slow it would take them 70 years for them to get home using, for them, conventional means, so they have to try and hunt down an alternative. If they were sporting a Star Wars hyperdrive of even Class 10, which is 20 times slower than the Millennium Falcon, they would have been able to make the 70,000 light-year trip in just over 6 months. For perspective, Class 10s are what you put on like droid-piloted freighters. By Star Wars standards, those are the glacially slow ships. So hyperdrives are way better than warp drives in every way, right? Well, no. Warp has the advantage that while slow, it's also super linear. It's basically just go that way really fast. So you can reposition in combat if needed. Go wherever you like as long as you don't fly directly into anything, stuff like that. It's like flying an airplane. The whole sky is open to you. Just, stay away from the big storm clouds, or in the case of Treks, try to stay out of ion storms and whatnot when possible. The slower speeds also mean that if you need to jump right now, you totally can. And unless you're extremely unlucky, you're going to be perfectly fine. You're not just going to ram something that you didn't realize was there. Multiple factions in Trek have even figured out various ways to adapt their weaponry to work while at warp. In particular, all photon torpedoes, if fired at warp, will maintain warp until they hit their target. Other weapons get adapted too, but that's not really what this video is about. Meanwhile, Lightspeed is more like traveling by high-performance sports car that can't go under 200 miles an hour. Technically, you can go anywhere, but if you don't want to destroy your car and quite possibly scatter bits of yourself everywhere, you should probably stick to roads. In Star Wars, this is why hyperspace lanes exist. Basically, all they are is just well-mapped out regions of space between worlds, along which travel is generally safe. You can technically hyperspace jump in any direction you like at the drop of a hat. It's just a really, really bad idea. This is yet another reason why The Rise of Skywalker is stupid. Hyperspace skipping requires absolute truckloads of plot armor to work. Fortunately, they had like 3 main characters on the ship at the time, so, they were perfectly fine. So yeah, you get crazy insane speed, but you have to be really, really careful when using it. This has a few side effects. For one, calculating hyperspace jumps takes a bit of time. As seen, every time that the Millennium Falcon is trying to get away from the Empire, they have to sit there and be like, all right, sorry, the computer's running for a bit. Let's tank a few shots from this Star Destroyer while it figures its stuff out and we can jump. It also means that the entry and exit points to any given system are pretty much set, and that's why things like the blockade of Naboo in Episode 1 can actually work. Sure, you can technically approach a planet from any angle you like, but due to hyperspace lanes, you can really only approach from a very narrow angle. This is also why, in Rogue One, Vader was able to jump his Star Destroyer right on top of the Rebel fleet over Scarif. He didn't actually do that on purpose. That's just the choke point where all the traffic has to come and go, so it wasn't really so much a matter of planning, so much as just really lucky timing, or unlucky if you're the Rebels. Finally, this all means that with very few exceptions, tactical hyperspace use is limited to just showing up and escaping. That's it. Thrawn did manage to pull off microjumps in Legends, but that took a ton of planning ahead, and it's not a feat that anyone else has really just managed to duplicate at all, as far as I know. And I'm not even sure if that's canon anymore, since Disney got their claws into everything and ruined it. So yeah, if you watched my Trek vs. Wars matchup series, you already know what I think about how this affects a matchup. Basically, in battles, warp could be used to great effect by even semi-competent captains to just keep a wide gap between them and their shorter-range Star Wars opponents. In the grand scheme of things, for a war scenario, however, this would mean that any Star Wars faction would have ready access to tons of reserve forces who can simply join the fight from tons of other systems if needed, And it means that if they're willing to adopt scorched earth tactics, which doesn't seem like much of a stretch for the Empire, they'd just be able to jump from badly defended planet to badly defended planet, thrashing them from orbit with their turbolasers and bombers, and then just leave before the Federation or whoever else it happens to be can actually get there and help, because they're relying upon the much slower warp drive. Even if they're only a few hours away by warp, which would mean they're like in a neighboring system because it's that slow, a few hours is plenty of time to do a ton of damage to most worlds. Heck, if the Empire could actually keep a Death Star around for more than a few days, unlike in the movies, they'd be able to just jump from Trek world to Trek world, blowing them up and moving on before the defenders could arrive. War's factions would definitely struggle more with protected worlds, but that's a more complicated discussion, which I cover in my Versus series. But at the same time, any faction that is exclusively warp-propelled would have a really hard time actually going on the offensive at all, since it would take literally years and potentially decades to just get to a lot of the more important Star Wars worlds. But what do you all think? Do you think I'm over or understating the power of either form of FTL travel? Do you think that the Holdo maneuver is the height of cinema and storytelling, despite the fact that it totally retroactively turns everyone in Star Wars into idiots for not trying it before, or just, developing the idea? Let me know in the comments. Again, I have a coffee link in the description if you want to support the channel, and until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.